This week, we welcome Padraic O'Reilly, co-founder and chief product officer from CyberSaint, to discuss how to align cyber risk to business risk through automation. In the leadership and communications section, how much does a CEO or business leader need to know about cybersecurity? How businesses can drive innovation while delivering operational excellence? 6 resume mistakes CISOs still make, and more. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly. Stopping advanced threats requires knowing exactly what you're up against. ExtraHop Reveal X is the only solution that shows you not just where intruders are going, but where they've been. 90-day look back and complete network visibility across the data center, cloud, and device edge helps security teams respond 84% faster with ExtraHop Reveal X network detection and response. Explore the interactive demo at securityweekly.com/ExtraHop. We're proud to announce CISO Stories, a new podcast series in partnership with Cybersecurity Collaborative and Cyber Reason. CISO Stories features the candid perspectives and experiences of frontline senior security executives and dives deep into timely security topics. CISO Stories is hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, VP of Cybersecurity Strategy at Cybersecurity Collaborative, and Sam Curry, Chief Product and Security Officer at Cyber Reason. Listen weekly as they speak with extraordinary CISOs by visiting securityweekly.com/CSP.
Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 224, recorded July 19th, 2021. I am your host, Matt Alderman, here in Colorado. Joining me remotely are my co-hosts. First, Mr. Adrian Sanabria. Welcome, Adrian.
Hey, Matt. Nice to be here again. Our jobs aren't automated yet, but I'm looking forward to talking about automating compliance work.
Yes, that's going to be a fun segment. And joining us remotely, filling in for an under-the-weather Jason Albuquerque, is Mr. Lee Neely. Welcome, Lee.
Oh, good to be here. Automating compliance work is something I've been looking at on my space in the .gov world, so I'm very interested to see what we can learn today.
All right, we're going to get there. First, a couple announcements. Cyber Risk Alliance, in partnership with InfraGard, has launched the Critical Infrastructure Resilience Benchmark Study. Measure your readiness for ransomware by completing the survey and getting your score. Visit securityweekly.com/CIRB to take the survey. Security Weekly Unlocked will be held in person this December 5th through 8th at the Hilton Lake Buena Vista. Our call for presentations deadline has been extended through July 23rd at 11:59 p.m. Eastern. Visit securityweekly.com/unlock to submit your presentation. This segment is sponsored by CyberSaint. To learn more, please visit securityweekly.com/CyberSaint. Padraic O'Reilly is Chief Product Officer and co-founder at CyberSaint, where he leads product innovation and development. His experience as a Harvard-trained economist, IT risk and compliance consultant, and his rapid exposure to cybersecurity led him to seek out CISOs, CIOs, and boards of directors at global organizations to pursue the answer to the question, how can cyber be managed, measured, and understood like any other business function? An expert in artificial intelligence and economic modeling, Padraic works with members of the Global 500 to research and deploy risk quantification, risk intelligence gathering, and risk reporting and communication strategies. Padraic, welcome back to Business Security Weekly.
Thanks, Matt. It's great to be back.
Now, I love this topic. A few people know that this was one of my first startups was in the compliance risk management space before GRC was called GRC. Right. I think we understand some of the challenges, but let's start there first. I mean, when you think about cyber risk, you think about regulatory risk, it's a business risk discussion. But one of the challenges in the space is the ability to really roll up cyber risk, regulatory risk to a business risk discussion, that you could have this adequate discussion with executive leaders, the board, about the importance of these two areas. Right. Has that discussion changed any in the last 15 or so years?
Well, I think it's changed in the last 5 years. I don't know how much it changed in the previous 10 up to that. Although, looking at some of our competitors in this space, I would say that the conversation really only got going when some of the good work over at NIST came out with the CSF. And the CSF, I think, gave an opportunity for a lot of the delivery companies, the big four, the integrators, and some of the software companies to begin having a discussion around measurement. So measurement was really hot a couple of years ago, and it was wildly controversial. I remember going to the NIST conference on measurement, and it was a food fight. But what shook out really were some best practices, and I think we're now at a crossroads where a lot of boards and C-suites are just more interested, and they're more interested in understanding cyber as a business function and understanding the risk exposure they have.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges here is the volume. Because I remember this in the early days, like when I was building Control Path back in 2006, 7, 8. I remember, talking to Qualys back at the time around, could I model, 500,000 assets in the software? I mean, scale was very different back then. When you think about the number of controls across a number of systems that then roll up on a regular basis to really influence business risk, that's a lot of data, right? And I think a lot of the legacy solutions had an architectural challenge, mine included, by the way. So a lot of this, I think we needed technology advancements to be able to process that much data, didn't we?
Yeah. And I think that's still the case to a certain extent, not just technology advancements, but, buy-in across the teams, because not every team that handles the vulnerability information is, going to be willing to expose some of that to the compliance team, to the risk team, and to the first, second, third lines of defense. So, I mean, it's while it's a logical problem and a data problem, I think that the data side of it is much improved. I mean, when we've done integrations into, scanning concerns, we don't have a great deal of difficulty there. We go into the API and we can pull vast amounts of data. And as long as we, as long as we know what we're looking for inside that data, we can be pretty specific about walking it into controls.
Yeah, and this is where I think the NIST cybersecurity framework and other frameworks. Look, there's other frameworks out there than the NIST CSF. ISO has been a framework that's been out there for a long time. Even some of the COBIT models, some of the older regulatory framework models are still out there. Is there a preferred model, or is it still kind of a combination across these different frameworks?
I mean, I think you see across enterprise companies that they have like 10 frameworks they work with. And that, some of that's just frameworks they've been working with for a long time. And then some of it is also the requirements that are getting pushed at them from, other parties. So sometimes if you talk to a bank, they might be benchmarked on 853. They might be doing some PCI, some HIPAA, but really what they're, an FFIEC, New York DFS, but really their major challenge is how do I report out on, CIS if I haven't benchmarked myself on CIS? So one of the other problems we've been caught up in for years now, and now we have live in the product, is the crosswalking problem, because some of the solutions around crosswalking have not really scaled. The idea that you pay for 5 crosswalks and then you're done and you can't do any more crosswalks, that's been a bit of an issue for security professionals as well. So there's the workhorse frameworks, like COBIT, the CIS controls, PCI, HIPAA, 853. We're an 853 and CSF shop, but only at the core of what we do, because when it comes to automation, and when it comes to crosswalking, it's much better to have a control like AC2, which has 16 line items and is very detailed and can map to multiple other controls in a framework like ISO. 27000 series is a little bit of a sort of a ISMS, broader pool. So if you're doing all the analytics on the deep pool, you can get to the shallower pools a little bit easier.
Right. I was laughing like internally, because I remember the problem statement when I built Control Path. It's either 1 or it's N. It's never any number in between. You just said 5. I get 5 crosswalks. I get 5 mappings to regulatory requirements. No, why 5? It's either 1 or it's N.
It's like some bad pricing discussion happened, and and they never revisited it or something, Personally, we want to be able to offer it as functionality, and it could be limitless. I mean, if you're a crosswalking maniac, you could go haywire on it, actually.
Exactly. Lee, did I hear something in there?
I was wondering, when it comes to control automation, there's, the holy grail is everything is automated, but the reality is we have administrative and technical controls. And I'm wondering, do people still understand that they're going to have to do some, non-technical checks to populate data, whether it's uploading copies of policy to not match policy controls or,
That's almost like a litmus test. I know exactly what you're talking. That's almost like a litmus test for whether or not anyone's ever looked at a control, right? So, when you get onto calls and people are like, our goal is to automate 90% of these. I'm like, have you read them? I mean, you might want to read them, because a lot of them say the organization does this, decides on, a course of action or a set of procedures. I don't think you're going to be automating that anytime soon, unless you have, HAL in 2001. The way I see it is, in all the research and development we've been engaged in, and this is with some very large concerns, you automate the things you can automate, right? So you can automate some access control stuff, some identity and access management, some vulnerability scanning, a lot of those control, system and information integrity, system and communications protection, some of the more technical controls. But I think, if you look across frameworks, you can get coverage, anywhere from 30 to 40%, which, is a lot. And those controls are historically difficult. They tend to be sticking points in organizations, because someone in compliance or risk might have to call IT, and that takes a lot of time. So if you're lighting those controls up in an automated way, you're making life easier for IT. You're making life easier for compliance and risk as well. And I don't think the PE controls about water shutoff for a fire are really going to be automatable. No, fire prevention, water shutoff, hiding the cables, all of the PE controls, a lot of the maintenance controls, the personnel controls, like, what are you going to do when you have visitors at a facility? I don't think you're going to be automating that either anytime soon.
Here's why this context is important, because I made an assumption back in 2004 that 80% of the controls were manual-based controls, 20% were technical. That's typical 80-20 rule.
Sure.
And so we designed software and we designed an architecture to manage collecting those manual controls, reporting against them, and rolling them up.
Right.
Here's the mistake we made. Those 20% controls have huge numbers associated to them. And this is where the automation challenge, I think, really came to a head, was when I took those 20% of controls, but I applied them to tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of systems. I didn't have the ability to automate that. Right. Because when I think about process procedure controls, even the human controls, maybe I can get away with assessing them once a year to make sure my policies and stuff are up to date, all my process documents are good, maybe quarterly, whatever. Sure. But here's where the real risk comes into play. It's as the threat landscape is changing and new vulnerabilities are being discovered that my risk profile changes really, really fast. And if I'm doing that manually, I miss the window.
You missed it completely. And I mean, that's when we talk to organizations, they're beginning to realize that. We used to say it exactly as you just did, which is, how can you justify risk decisions based on data that's, 6 months old, 9 months old, 350 something days old. You can't. And it's crazy. It's just crazy. So, if you do get some of your vulnerability scanning, some of your, your configuration checks, some of those things automated, your data is much fresher. If it's rolling up the risk, if you're rolling it through the controls and you're doing it across applications and it is bubbling up to risk, you're making decisions that are informed, on data that's refreshing on a healthy cadence. Not, you're not looking through spreadsheets that were done 6 months ago by a consultancy or whatever, and trying to justify that to your boss. So that's, I think, really one of the ultimate cases for automation is that, you can't make credible decisions with respect to risk, particularly in the landscape we're in now, with the morphing ransomware risks and phishing risks all the time they're changing. You can't make these decisions without fresh data.
Yeah, and it's not only system data. I spent a lot of time in third-party risk too. Think about the supply chain risk. How do I start to understand the potential risk profile of all these vendors or all these supply chain areas if I don't have some sort of refresh data on a regular basis? Because again, we see those attacks coming. So it's not just IT system data, it's any third party or supply chain relationship that also needs that fresh data.
Absolutely. And some of that, the complexity of that is mind bending in some ways. Some of the dependencies and some of the software vulnerabilities we've seen of late. So again, everybody realizes that this needs to happen. It's there are a few sticking points though. An established practice within organizations and some of the legacy practices militate somewhat against adopting the new approach. So it's a constant conversation, and we're automating everywhere we can and doing it as quickly as we can. But getting organizations to adopt rapidly is a challenge.
Yeah. Adrian, go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to say prepping for audits is huge, like especially if you work for, a fintech or something like that, the amount of time you can spend just gathering evidence for auditors as they request it is huge. And I remember back when cloud first started to come out and, some of these tools that would do the compliance work for you, when we first started moving, evolving from spreadsheets to actual applications. The idea of just collecting that evidence and keeping it fresh automatically so that when the auditor comes in, you just give them their auditor account into the system or access to that folder where it's all been collected, and you get, days, weeks in your life back.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Evidentiary management is so tricky. And it's actually for us an aspect of crosswalking too, because sometimes the auditors will want to see how you're doing on another standard that you're not terribly familiar with, or don't do day-to-day work in it. And if you have the evidence associated with one of your test once, use many type frameworks like 853, you're able to now in system have that evidentiary association port over to the other controls, and that can give you back weeks. I mean, there's all sorts of cases where giving back folks weeks of their life is what we are trying to do. Like RFPs come in, for example, and you might have a whole storehouse of answers that you've built up over the years, but then they give you a different set of questions. Well, what do you do there, right? You're going to lose 2 weeks going from your baseline knowledge and answers over into the new question set. And that's those types of, practices they drive people crazy. I mean, I've had to fill out RFPs, it's
SIG-Lite, and everyone is different, and the questions are in a different order.
Yeah. And how do you map all that? It's just, and then you wind up, you get stuck doing it on a weekend or something too, and you're like, oh God, I can't believe this. But again, with crosswalking, we just pass the new questions to a processor, right? And relate it to the answers you already have. So, 85 or 80% of the work has been done. You might have a QA step in there, but you've saved a major amount of time.
Now, a question there: how much of that is automated? Like, are you using NLP or something like that? Because maybe the questions don't match exactly.
They don't match exactly. Yeah, we're using NLP. So I hired a couple of folks a couple of years ago because I'd begun to experiment with NLP around controls, because part of automating controls, you might have to take scan data, right? Scan data has findings, right? And you can say, oh, RA5 is green because they're doing vulnerability scanning. RA51 is green, or halfway to green or yellow. You can do all that, with just the idea that you're doing vulnerability scanning, but you can't reach into the findings of the vuln scans and suggest controls. So we built some NLP out around, what does it mean when you see, there's an XSS, an XS S vulnerability, or you've got a SQL injection vulnerability. Oops, SI10, SI10.5 lights up. So that initial foray into NLP around controls and vulnerability data brought us to the crosswalking problem. And a researcher that I have on staff out of Rensselaer, he built, a multi-stage algorithm with NLP to do the crosswalking, and we've been QAing it for the last 2 or 3 months, and we're building out the UI. So the UI the build is quite involved around the UI, because you have different kinds of frameworks. You might have frameworks that are just blobs of text, mapped to blobs of text. You might have frameworks that are broken into individual control actions, right? And those are different kinds of crosswalks. So there's a fair amount of UI work that has to be done. And because we're in regulatory regimes, we have to have that QA step for due care, for legal reasons. So we're very excited, though, because we have automated control crosswalking now, and it can be done live and in real time.
So I had a question on that. One of the things I spent a bunch of time in college on was natural language processing, which was fairly immature. And are there decent tools, or you have to write this from scratch that you can build on for?
There's a lot. It's like standing on the shoulders of those who've come before. A lot of the behemoths like Google have done some very good work in NLP and made some of it publicly available. So there are a lot of tools publicly available to do some training. That said, you still have to build the algorithm itself, and you still have to collect all the security language, right? So in order to build a really robust NLP around security language, you've got to have a vast compendium of security language and train it many different ways. So there's a lot of different layers to the NLP, and there are a lot of different models, and it's sort of a hybrid approach, so that you get the best of one kind of model and the best of another kind of model as well.
Interesting. So let's talk about best practice, right? Because this is not, you just don't flip a switch and turn this thing on, right? There's a lot of work that goes under the covers here in order to get this into an alignment where it can be effective. So, Patrick, where do you start? Do you start on the framework crosswalk side and then go to the asset side and then kind of marry them together? Do you start at the asset side and go over to the control and roll up side? Where do you start? What's the best approach here?
Well, we start wherever the enterprise companies, and even just the commercial companies that come to us, we start wherever they want to start, because we're integrated risk management, and that's the best part of being integrated risk management. If they want to start at risk, we can start at risk. If they want to start at the level of the controls, they can start there. If they want to start with central visibility or making sure they're all on one standard across the organization, we can start there as well. We really do have to work with our partners on that very closely. I wish I could say there's a best way to do it, right? But each organization has its own culture to some extent, and there's way more similarities than you'd think. They are all trying to do the same thing. They're all trying to understand their cyber risk. They're all trying to deal with supply chain risk, and they're all trying to roll that up in a way to the board across assets, across business units, across really complex structures, and then have a case to make to the business side around dollars and probabilities, and they want it to be credible. So they all want the same result, but sometimes they're starting with different frameworks. They're starting with different teams. They're starting with different legacy practices. Sometimes they'll have 5, 10 business units, and each business unit has its own unique way of working, right? And what we have to do is sort of be open to adjusting a little bit here on a score model maybe, or looking at how they've run this in Excel for a while and getting some buy-in around, well, we can support most of what you're doing in system and then build it out over time, the rest of it. So I would just say that, you can get on the elevator at any floor, but we're all going hopefully to the top where there's a good meal and we spin around and get to look at the city.
Yeah, as long as you don't have a thunderstorm and it stops spinning like it did 2 years ago in Vegas.
That's dangerous.
Yes, I was there for that.
So I had a question. You talk about preparing information for senior management. Are we still, let's give senior management access to the dashboard, or do we let them drill down anymore?
Well, we've had to build roles that allow senior management, if they want to come in and look. We have an observer role, which allows for access onto what we call our governance dashboards, which are really all of the dashboards that leverage the tagging inside the system to look at bigger things like business units and states and, sectors and supply chain. So it's all aggregated. You're out of the controls, you're out of the individual assessments, and all the data's been rolled up to the functional levels that executives want to look at. So we're all for giving them access. We're all for giving them access into it. We've built a lot of functionality around that. We've built security return on investment functionality as well, so that you can game out some scenarios around remediations. And we continue to hear requirements from organizations around wanting more functionality concerning making the case upstairs.
Yeah. I just thinking you don't want to. Go ahead, Matt. Go ahead.
No. I was just finish, Lee, please.
Okay, cool. I just was wondering because I was thinking we don't want, very senior management looking to how much of, MS 0814 or whatever, was where. You want to look at a bigger level for them.
Oh yeah. Well, that's why we built the governance dashboards. I was one of the biggest energy companies in the world who 2 years ago, sort of pointed us in that direction. And you don't go from you can drill down to maybe the category of data, but you don't then go down into the individual implementations from there.
Yeah, I mean, the real value in the dashboards, ultimately, if you do this right, is you understand where the biggest risk areas are that are going to impact the business, not MSO 8067 where they are, all right? Because that's just the executive team doesn't need to know that, but they do need to know, has it changed the risk profile of a part of the business that could impact operations or reputation or other business risk areas?
Yes, absolutely. And that's our real preoccupation on the risk register and the governance dashboards, to present that case so that they can understand it. If they want to understand it geographically, they can, the risks. If they want to understand it by business unit, they can. If they want to understand it by application type, if they want to understand it by, by individual risk, if they want a broad aggregate look into ransomware risk across many systems, they can have that view too. So, no, you don't want to get too carried away with the control talk. They generally don't want to talk about, AC2.G. The fourth or fifth or sixth item in a 15 line item control. But they do want to see where they are on access control. And they do want to understand, do we need to make sure that 2FA is on all remote desktop protocol, or, like we see recently, they do want to understand that. What would it cost to do that?
Are we seeing certain trends with all the ransomware activity going on that are like areas that people should really focus on? Have you seen, based on your customer set, like these are the handful of things, if you had your arms around them, you'd be in a better position? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I talk about that all the time with, with the press or even with the customers, like what, or even in a patent I'm writing now, it's like one of the central cases of it. What's the difference between, a pipeline concern with respect to ransomware? And what's the difference, if you look at a municipality or a water treatment plant, and CISA has put out a great deal of guidance around that. But ultimately in system, in our software, that relates to, which controls are most cost effective for, on your particular sector, what should you be looking at? And we can see, some pretty clear patterns around that. There are certain sectors that aren't really that worried about ransomware, but that's because, they segment their networks. They've got 2FA on everything. They tend to do best practice. And then there's other sectors that, have some serious vulnerabilities, and third-party software is a scary one for a lot of them. And I would say there's a lot of talk about that, about what a security group, what a good security group or selection of mitigations or controls looks like with respect to a particular risk like ransomware.
Well, you just mentioned two right off the top of my head: network segmentation and MFA. I'm sure there's a few more, but if I can segment the network and stop the spread, that helps, right? And if I've got two-factor on, that prevents things like the water one where they came in remotely and got access to the plant. No damage in that one, but still, multi-factor authentication is important in that kind of scenario.
Absolutely, and not too prohibitive to put in place, right? I mean, so there's a component of security return on investment as well. Making the case that we do the things that are there, and you get the biggest bang for the buck.
Absolutely, Adrian, Lee. Any additional questions for Padraic while we have him?
No, I'm great. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think it was a good conversation. Anything else I would ask? We'd need at least 10 or 15 more minutes. It'd go down a rabbit hole. It's a good topic.
That's all right. I like rabbit holes. Padraic, thank you so much for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
To learn more about how to align your cyber risk to business risks through automation, please visit securityweekly.com/CyberSaint. We're going to take a quick break and then cover the leadership and communications articles for this week.